Welcome to another edition of Flashpoints on Washington Unplugged. I'm Bob Orr, along with our national security analyst, Juan Zarate, as always.
Good to see you, Bob.
Good to see you, Juan. Well, front and center, of course, is Libya, and this now appears to be a full-fledged civil war, nearly. I mean, you got the rebels taking territory, losing territory. The pro-Gaddafi forces are really being very aggressive. Where do we stand with this?
I think the world is recognizing that Gaddafi's regained his footing, and what we have here is, at best, a stalemate, and at worst, a civil war bordering on humanitarian disaster. And so the question now is, what do you do about it? We've said, the Obama administration and others have said that Gaddafi is illegitimate. He has to be toppled, has to be removed. So what can be done? And so now there are debates within NATO, the African Union, calls from the Organization of the Islamic Conference for a no-fly zone and military intervention. That's creating quite a debate within the United States and certainly within the Western powers, because they're trying to balance the need to topple Gaddafi and to make their words matter, and to be seen to be on the side of the rebels and the protesters and human rights. At the same time, they don't want to get caught in a quagmire. They don't want mission creep, and they don't want to become central protagonists in what has largely been a Libyan affair. Because we know, no doubt, we've already seen this from Gaddafi, that if there is foreign intervention of some sort, even a no-fly zone, Gaddafi will use that to his advantage. He will portray this internally with his tribes and with his military as an attempt by the West to, gather force to take over colonially, to take over the oil resources. And so there's a very difficult balance here. You want to prevent humanitarian disaster. You want to topple Gaddafi. But people don't want to be front and center. They don't want to be protagonists, and that's what the Obama administration is struggling with.
It can't be a unilateral action by the United States for all the obvious reasons. But if you check off all the boxes and you wait for the UN and you wait for NATO or whoever else comes to the table as a coalition partner, you might be too late.
I think that's part of it. I think the facts on the ground are unfolding very quickly, and maybe more quickly than the international community can react. But I think there are then two issues. One is, what form does this take? Can it be legitimized either from a UN perspective or otherwise to make whatever intervention happens appear legitimate? And can you have, for example, the French and the British and the Italians take the lead, although that has colonial taste to it as well? Secondly, what does intervention look like? Because even if you do a no-fly zone, does that really topple Gaddafi? Does that do the trick? And I'm not sure the answer is yes.
It would give the rebels some cover, though.
It would give the rebels some cover. It would allow the civil war to continue, but it doesn't put an end to the conflict, and it doesn't put an end to the humanitarian crisis. And there's no guarantee that Gaddafi is overturned or toppled tomorrow. And so then the West has to ask itself another question. What more do they do? What more can be done? Do you arm the rebels? Not clear who they are. Do you impose harsher sanctions? That takes a long time to take effect. So this is really a fight to the finish, and the West, and the United States in particular, is asking the question, what role should we play? What effect can we have?
So the policy right now is we want Gaddafi to leave, but it's not clear what kind of hammer, if any, we have really to make that happen.
That's exactly right, and there are debates within the Obama administration about what that means. Secretary Gates, Secretary of Defense, really wanting to be cautious here. He said a few weeks ago that he would be very cautious about asking further military resources to be used in the Middle East. He does not want to overextend what is already viewed as an overextended military commitment in Afghanistan and Iraq. And so this is a delicate balance for the administration with a lot of sniping from the right and the left.
So Gaddafi shows no signs of leaving. I mean, he's been adamant that he will stay there. He will fight to the last bullet, I think he said. But he's got some friends who have said, hey, if you need some help, you can give us a call. And it's a curious list. Well,
it's a curious list. It's a resurrection of the Cold War era names that we're familiar with. Castro, Robert Mugabe from Zimbabwe, Chavez from Venezuela, or Daniel Ortega from Nicaragua. These are the cadre of allies that Gaddafi has that have come out in support of him. Chavez has denied a lot of the reports of human rights abuses, has declared that this is really an excuse for the United States to intervene militarily. I don't think Gaddafi is on the verge of leaving anywhere, but if he were to leave, I think he would look to someplace like Zimbabwe and Mugabe, where Gaddafi has villas, has some influence, and I think he would retreat there. But I think what's really interesting is there's a spotlight on this alliance of rogue individuals, people that Gaddafi used to host, people he's praised. For example, Hugo Chavez has received from Gaddafi a human rights award. There's Hugo Chavez Stadium outside of Benghazi in Libya. And so there's kind of a real love affair among the revolutionaries of the world, and Gaddafi has always been a center of this. And so what you see is those allies coming to the fore again.
And so far, we haven't heard any voices in the Arab world really offering him a whole lot of support.
No, Gaddafi has not made a lot of friends in the Arab world, to be honest. Recall his great fights and tension with the Saudis. He was actually behind an assassination attempt of then Crown Prince Abdullah, now King Abdullah. So there's no love lost there with the Saudis. The Iranians don't like him, clearly. Al-Qaeda and the Salafi extremists don't like him either. He's always done battle with them.
He keeps blaming Al-Qaeda for his problems.
He keeps blaming Al-Qaeda. He blames us. He blames drugged-out youth. And so, he does not have a ton of friends, but he does have some core revolutionary friends who are out there, Chavez among them. And Chavez, by the way, has agreed to mediate if need be. I don't think anyone's taking that very seriously.
That could be interesting.
Very interesting.
To say the least. Very important policy change this week for the Obama administration. For 2 years plus now, they've been promising to close Guantanamo Bay, but this week the president came out with executive orders guaranteeing it's going to stay open for a while and have a very important part in going forward how we handle detainees.
Bob, I hate to say I told you so, but I told you so. I think this is the codification of what we were anticipating, which is not only resumption of the military commission's process down in Guantanamo, not only a process to allow for indefinite detention, but also the reality that Guantanamo isn't going to close anytime soon, certainly not in the first term of an Obama administration. And so what you have really is a way that the administration is trying to right the ship of its mistakes early on to try to put a legal framework around the reality that we're going to have to hold individuals even if they aren't going to be put on trial, criminal trial or military commission. I've been saying this from the start, that what we're looking at is upwards of 90 people who are likely going to be held in indefinite detention, in part because they're considered to be dangerous still. We don't have enough evidence to present at a court to actually prove it the way we would like to in a criminal court or military commission. And some of them, like the Yemeni detainees, are just too dangerous to release in an environment like Yemen that is so volatile, that has Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula making headway with a very sort of uneasy government in Sana'a trying to hold Yemen together. And so this in some ways is the final codification of what we'd anticipated, which is preventive detention, Guantanamo's open, military commissions are going to start.
Well, in effect, I mean, the Obama administration now has endorsed the Bush administration plan for dealing with these people who fall between the cracks of being prosecutable or releasable.
Well, to give you analysis, not to speak as a former Bush administration official, I think the Obama administration would say, look, the reason we're having to do this was the mess that we were left with, the lack of prosecutable evidence for some of these guys, the fact that we had Guantanamo at all, and the system of preventive detention. In fairness, though, I think the reality is that you had in the post-9/11 environment a wartime footing. And by the way, the Obama administration reasserts the law of war baseline for all of this. And what you had were individuals being picked up in the context of a war. They weren't being picked up to be prosecuted. And so the reality is you have individuals who are very dangerous, known to be Al-Qaeda members, trained with Al-Qaeda, long-time ties, who we're just not going to release, even if we put them on trial and even if they were acquitted, like Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. We're just not going to let them go. And it doesn't matter what mess happened before or after. The reality is we're in a situation where we have a long-term threat from Al-Qaeda, individuals in our custody who are too dangerous to let go, and in some cases not enough evidence to present in court to allow us to justify that detention using the court system. And so what are you left with? A preventive detention process, and now the administration has an executive order that allows a process for review to make sure that we're actually putting in some due process so that individuals aren't left to rot for life in detention. But that may be what we see.
Well, and it could be a de facto life sentence for many of these people because it's until a cessation of hostilities occurs. And how do you define the end of a war in the war on terror when we're not fighting a state? We're fighting an ideology.
This is exactly the legal problems and issues that we've faced since 9/11. This is an unconventional enemy. They don't wear uniforms. They don't come from a nation state with which we're at war. They are in places like Afghanistan and Iraq and Yemen, but they're also in the cities and streets of Western cities in the U.S. and Western Europe. The duration of this is unclear. The direction it takes is unclear. And so In some ways, I've been a critic of the administration in this regard. We have not set the template for what the legal framework looks like moving forward. This is all Band-Aid measures from a retrospective perspective. They're looking to deal with Guantanamo, to deal with past practices. The reality is this is a problem that's going to be with us. And in fact, the executive order only applies to existing Gitmo detainees. It doesn't apply to anyone else we take into custody, and it doesn't apply to all those we're taking into custody and have in custody in places like Afghanistan. And so this is just a Band-Aid for now. It codifies preventive detention, which the president in his speech in May of '09 said he would have. And unfortunately, sort of unmasks the reality of our detention policy, which looks an awful lot like what the Bush administration had in '08 and '09.
Okay, finally, let's move to a very controversial topic that's going to be center stage on Capitol Hill beginning tomorrow. New York Congressman Peter King convenes his hearing on Islamic Muslim radicals. He's been criticized as kind of singling out a religion or a people, picking on a culture. What's going on here? Because the fact is we've seen a lot of radical Muslims involved in terror attacks and terror attempts.
I think the problem is there is concern in the United States for growing radicalization among Muslim American communities and members. We've seen an uptick of the cases. There aren't a lot of them. I mean, I've been one to argue that we've got to temper our sense of Chicken Little reaction to the volume of cases that we've seen. But there has been a spike of cases, more Americans drawn to the ideology of Al-Qaeda. We've seen, obviously, the Fort Hood case, the case in Little Rock of the individual killing Army recruiter. There have been other cases foiled by the FBI. So clearly, Americans are being radicalized, and it's clear that Al-Qaeda, and in particular folks like Anwar al-Awlaki, the Yemeni-American cleric who's a part of the Yemen branch of Al-Qaeda, are trying to draw more Americans into the movement and trying to give them justification to act in the United States against fellow citizens. In fact, al-Awlaki has called this a duty. And so the problem is real. The question is, what do you do about it? And to a certain extent, what responsibility do Muslim Americans have to inoculate their communities against this radicalization? I think it's a completely legitimate question, and it should be part of public discourse. The problem is the tone and manner that this has unfolded has felt to some like a blanket targeting of an entire community or sets of communities. Because I think it's important to remember that Muslim Americans in the United States come from a variety of backgrounds, different historical legacies in the United States. It's a very diverse and powerful sets of communities. So, the question is, are we painting with a broad brush an entire segment of the American population without being nuanced enough about it and without being careful enough about the language used? And I think the prospect of a hearing raises lots of fears about exactly that.
The danger is people don't get past the headline. They don't get into the issue per se. Now, Representative King, not to do his bidding for him, he has said, look, the Muslim faith is under attack by Al-Qaeda. They're targeting your youth. So he's saying, we're not picking the topic. Al-Qaeda has picked the topic.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think the question, though, is how are the hearings framed and what's the substance look like? I think we have to wait. I think too many people have been prejudging what the hearings are actually going to produce. And I think some of this has to be, we have to listen and have to have a dialogue. Representative Charles Ellison, the only Muslim American member of Congress, will be the first to testify. I think that'll be very powerful and important. But you'll have others there testifying. We need to listen. And I think the key question is, how do Muslim Americans view themselves in the context of this radicalization? Do they view themselves as enlisted and empowered as American citizens, or viewed as other and isolated from the broader American polity? And I think part of the problem is you've had some ugly incidents leading up to the hearings where Muslim Americans have felt isolated and assaulted in some ways.
There have been some hard feelings, too, on both sides. Muslim Americans saying it hasn't been a real great partnership. The FBI has tried to reach out. They've tried to cultivate friends in the Muslim communities for all the right reasons. But to a degree, that hasn't worked out the way some of these communities would have liked.
No, and what's ironic and unfortunate is that it appears that the tension with Muslim American communities, between law enforcement, the U.S. government, and those communities, has actually gotten worse over time, much worse than anything we saw, I think, after 9/11 in the first few years. And so the problem's gotten worse in some ways, which is quite unfortunate. You saw the administration, by the way, host an event or be part of an event this past Sunday at the Adams Center,
Right.
an Islamic center here in Northern Virginia. They were trying to send a signal that not only are Muslims fully Americans, but that there's going to be an attempt to enlist them and to be inclusive in terms of a countering violent extremism strategy, which they laid out on Sunday.
Another very busy day on Flashpoints. Juan,
Lots of good stuff, Bob.
thanks as always. We'll look for you next time.
Thank you.